I think it's fair to say that where we find ourselves today in regards with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is extremely complicated on several levels, the political one being just one of them. But in terms of how you see things and from your experience, knowing Israel probably from the inside, and also being someone who has studied this particular conflict now for a number of decades. Apologies if I'm giving away your probable age, but I mean, how would you assess where we are today? I mean, if someone was to say to you, you know, Daniel Levy, you know this. You know these people, you know who's involved, you know, yeah, it's not just Israel that you know, but you also know America, you know Britain. So how would you basically describe where we are today from the political perspective, but also militarily, strategically? You know, what does it look like to you?
Well, that's quite a way to start our conversation, Dr. Anas. So I would probably say the following. And as you say, there's part of this which is not very complex at all, which is that there is an occupying power, an occupied people. There is a huge asymmetry of power, and there are people, the Palestinian people, denied their rights, and that's the thing that has to be rectified. But of course, the rectifying of that takes us into this world of complexity. And I guess my starting point would be that it does matter what we're seeing today, what we've seen the last months, the direction of travel of Israel, the politics, a significant degree of the society. And while I'm as big a critic as the next person who believes in rights and universal values and the rule of law of the traditional pre-Netanyahu Ben-Gvir Smotrich approach, and I think the designation made before this government by Palestinian groups, by Israeli human rights groups, by Amnesty, by Human Rights Watch, by a number of governments, the designation made that the regime that Israel was running meets the legal bar of the definition of apartheid, because that definition, that's a crime under international law. That is a legal definition. It's not, does it look close enough to South Africa? That's not the question. So while I would say that was a correct designation to make, and it's a designation that predated Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, I think it's important to acknowledge that there is a difference between that, and that was something that needed to be dismantled. But there's a difference between that and what you have today, which is a whole new level of danger, of destruction, and of extremism. And so I think I'm saying that because I think some people, sometimes for understandable reasons, sometimes for less understandable reasons, have a tendency to say they're all the same. Now, I do think that the Zionist political spectrum in Israel, I don't know if any of it could ever have been post-state, okay, because there were different strands of Zionism before the state gets established. But in its history, I don't know if any of those could ever have really come to terms with Palestinian rights in the fullest sense of that term. But and I acknowledge that there is a spectrum here of all of which accords to some these days to some model of apartheid. But I think that what we see in front of our eyes right now is that the differences matter, and that the extremity things have gone to puts into a sharp focus an effort at a second Nakba, a second displacement of Palestinians. It is an eradicationist, a displacement agenda, which I think right now also has this genocidal component to it. And so it matters that one walks that back into a different place, not that the centrist alternative offers a way forward to some kind of promised land of peace and justice and equality, but it does offer a way out of the extreme danger of today, and then you build from there. And I guess the second main point on the strategic broad plane, I would argue, is that we couldn't have gotten to this place. If one looks at this from a historical perspective, one couldn't have got to this place without the extent of the impunity accorded to Israel and its actions by its Western allies, led by the US, of course, across decades, including and crucially during what was supposedly a peace process era. And that all collapses. Again, people will have different judgments on whether there was any real prospect, any intention to even undo the post-67 occupation, let alone address the questions that preceded that in the Oslo effort. But the fact that this came about in a unipolar geostrategic moment of American leadership, and at the same time we have the breakthrough in South Africa, obviously not a perfect dispensation there, but Mandela is released, apartheid is undone, the ANC comes to power. We had the breakthrough in Northern Ireland, and perhaps it was possible that there could have been a breakthrough here, but not if Israel was never held accountable for the things it did, not only to violate international law, but also to violate prospects for peace. So I think that role played by the West really matters.
So I mean, I take from that you see Oslo in 1993 as a moment where potentially all of this could have been avoided. Am I correct?
Okay, so I apologize that it's not a yes and no. I am very cognizant and sympathetic to the critiques of Oslo, and in particular that this was an attempt to, at best, address the 67 occupation and to sweep 48 Nakba Palestinian refugee rights under the table. At worst, an attempt to reorganize how Israel managed not only 48, but its post-67 occupation. And that's certainly where we are today. But let's remember, at the time, this was a decision by a PLO that retained significant credibility, not the PLO today, the Palestinian Authority, which has been thoroughly co-opted. Yeah. So this decision, well, whatever one thinks of it, on the part of the PLO to say 22%, 67 lines, that's where we want to get to, had some traction amongst significant cohorts of Palestinians. Yes, it had its critics, and they had a good case, and they were proven to be correct. But could one at least have gotten to a place where the occupation was drawing down, not being entrenched, where this Israeli drive to maximalism was not fed and fueled? Conceivably, one could have got there. I think crucially, Israel continuously during those negotiations not only nickeled and dimed the process to death with demands that were totally unreasonable, but also kept pushing that whatever deal was agreed would constitute an end of all claims, which was a way of saying we're not addressing the refugees and their rights and their confiscated property, the fact that they were expelled. We're also embedding in this deal that they have no rights anymore. And that, I think, rendered the whole thing somewhat impossible to advance. And that will have to be revisited if there are ever talks again. And there was never any attempt to say we need a truth and reconciliation process as one's had in other conflict situations. And I think that would be more important now than ever. But could we have avoided going down this path? I think yes. Justice and equality and everything dealt with? I think no.
I mean, we're talking obviously about something that happened 31 years ago. And, you know, there are so many developments, there are so many events that have occurred in that scope of time. But focusing on Israel, but also a little bit on whom you say failed to keep Israel bound to the terms of the agreement. Was it the fact that the United States specifically played a role in allowing Israel to continue to go against the terms of what could have been a moment of transformation in regards with this conflict? Or is it that there is something embedded within Israel? And this is, by the way, a question that I ask myself, and many of our audiences ask as well, and that is Israel's sort of acting with impunity, is that as a result of a political design, or is it more ideological? Is it something, we hear about the God-given rights. We talk about the projects of Zionism. We talk about, but actually, I mean, is it more political than it is ideological, or is it the other way around? What is the main driving force behind the fact that we missed? And once again, I mean, I realized that back then you were more active in advising the Israeli government. But the question remains. That was, if you go back to the terms of the Oslo Agreement, that was incredible. I mean, basically, the Palestinians recognized Israel. The Palestinians accepted to, go back to 67 and nothing more. The terms were absolutely incredible, and one could see how that could have been an absolute transformative moment. So how do you see this? Why is it that we missed that?
Yeah, and so first of all, really important to get that timing, what you've just laid out, which is that according to Oslo, with all its problems and its limitations, a final status deal resolving borders, Jerusalem, refugees was listed there as one of the issues that had to be resolved, etc. All of that had a deadline of May 1999.
Yeah.
So we are now a quarter of a century plus past that deadline. We just marked that quarter of a century deadline. So, yeah, I think acknowledging that also just brings into real clarity the idea that we're still keeping going with something which expired. And there was a reason that you had a short timeline, because you can't sustain this idea that you can build confidence without addressing at least some of the core issues. Now, the other point that you make is you're basically saying to me, and I think quite rightly, wait a minute. Number one, if Israel wanted this, if Israel went into this a process in good faith, why would it need the US or anyone else to hold it accountable, to hold its feet to the fire, to make sure it didn't deviate? Yep. If there was a sincerity there, then why would you need that outside inducement, incentive structure? Number one. And number two, what was not to like? In fact, what was not to grab with both arms from an Israeli Zionist perspective when, as you acknowledge, the PLO didn't sign off, we hereby concede all the rights of the refugees, but in practice, that was the two-state model being pursued was understood to not bring justice to the right on the rights of the refugees. Number two, it's a mini state on 22%. Not only do the PLO sign off on this, but in 2002 you get the bigger yes. You've gotten the Palestinians to yes. In 2002, in the Beirut resolution of the Arab League meeting endorsing the Arab Peace Initiative, the entire Arab world gets to yes on mini Palestine on 22%. Yes, there were the other issues that would have to be resolved in terms of Syria, but basically you've gotten to yes. So why was Israel not grabbing this? And therefore, and this is the thing that you're drawing on, and therefore shouldn't this tell us something about the very essence of this project that received its imprimatur from the colonial powers earlier in the 20th century? You get the UN partition plan endorsing it in 47. You then get the Nakba and the war of 47 to 49, which not only takes that partition plan, but expands what would be the Israeli part of this? You get the expulsion of the Palestinians. So, Daniel Levy, what is not clear to you about what this is? And I think there's a lot to that, and I'm certainly not going to ignore that. And it is very possible, and I wrote about this just a few weeks prior to October 7th on the 30th anniversary of Oslo, where I say that the in a Peace in Orient 21, if anyone wants to look it up. And what I argue in that piece is that the proof of lived reality is that Zionism in practice, actual existing Zionism, could not come to terms with the idea and with the reality of Palestinian rights, Palestinian self-determination, drawing a border. And I do agree, that's where the evidence goes. I guess what I am challenging is an overly deterministic view of where this had to go, because I do think that ideology is ideology, and what one can achieve in practice is a different thing when your ideology bumps up against reality. So was it inevitable that Israel could continue down this path? Is a different question to were the seeds of this path embedded in the project as it came about, as it was realized, as Israelis internalized what this state was going to be. And I think those are two separate questions. And so for me, the context, the politics, what avenues could have been closed in the face of Israel by a different external approach. And by external approach, it's not just the US and it's not just the West. Yes, lion's share goes with them. But where are the neighboring states? Where are the Arab states? If we're looking at South Africa apartheid parallels, the role of the frontline states in rejecting apartheid South Africa was crucial. Where does the Palestinian leadership go on a journey post-Oslo as it embeds itself into this permanent occupation, denial of rights reality? So what I'm saying is that Israel can't act entirely of its own choosing. Israel exists, as every actor does, in an atmosphere which can open opportunities that should never exist, and it can narrow those. And so that's where I'm saying there's nothing inevitable to where we are today.
I think that's quite clear. The reason why I go back to Oslo, besides the fact that I think that it was a historic moment where we could have, been in a sliding door situation where we would have ended up somewhere else. But because...
Anas, can I jump in for a sec?
Of course, yes, of course.
Because it just come into my mind, there were many... I can speculate as to what were the intentions of key individuals on any party. In particular, I can speculate on the Israeli party. But something struck me then, and it's stayed with me ever since. One of the guys who did the secret back channel before it was taken on by the Israeli government was Dr. Ron Pundak. And he was a mentor of mine. And he since passed away very young, but very tragically. And Ron told me at the time, and we used to spend hours together drafting texts. This was after the first Oslo. And Ron said to me once, you know what? Israel's crazy. It should have said, my goodness, we've got yes for an answer. We shouldn't be fighting over, is it exactly 100% one-to-one land swaps? We should be offering more. We should be going the extra mile because this is the opportunity. And that mindset, which Ron was very unusual in having, did not characterize other people. It did not characterize the official position. And I think that would have had to have been the mindset. You could have come to this and say, you know what, how do we make good on the refugee issue without changing the fundamental dynamics? The fact that Israel never did that, I think, will be something that Israel lives to rue, and it probably should be ruing that in these very moments. And I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, not at all. And that word that you just used, mindset, is the one that I'm trying to sort of hone into. And because You see, you spoke when we first started talking. You spoke about the Netanyahu ben Gvir Smotrich sort of system or mentality that governs Israel right now. But the question or the argument could be had that actually it goes beyond just the right, the political right, or even the far right of Israel. That there is something that is embedded within the mindset of the political status, whatever it may be, whether you have a Likud or whatever kind of government, it's there. I mean, the fact is that embedded within Israel is the kind of mindset that prevents any kind of self-regulation. So there's that argument that there is something intrinsically wrong. And I'd like to explore that a little bit, but also something else. And my question about whether it be political or ideological is quite deliberate because, you can always counter a political project with another political project. But the question is, how do you counter a system that is based absolutely and cemented in ideology? How do you do that? When someone, let me just lay it out there. If someone believes that they have a God-given right, to a particular piece of land, how do you convince them otherwise? That's, it's an almost lost battle from the outset. Or it's a zero-sum game. It's a sort of a fight to the bitter end. So that's the reason why, I want to explore that particular moment and what went through the collective mindset of the Israeli decision makers to miss out on that kind of opportunity and to get us effectively to where we are today. I'm going to come back to the Palestinian leadership because I think that that's also elementary. But that particular point is something that I'd like to explore a little bit more.
Yeah, and look, I mentioned the Palestinian leadership not to go to he said, she said, and both sidesism. Yeah. I mention it because you can't understand where we are without that, but it's something that Palestinians will ultimately have to resolve and decide for themselves, and something that I bring less value in speaking to. So I want to explain why I'm going there. So I think people are complex, and decision making and the pressures that come to bear on that are complex. And it is certainly true that even Israel's most secular leaders would, at the core of how they see things, almost certainly have said, look, you know what? There is something a bit miraculous in Jewish eschatological kind of terms about this coming about. So at some point you give way to the idea that there's an element of the utopian, or perhaps more accurately, the dystopian about this project. And therefore, that mindset matters. And I would argue this may be a word that has to not be used if one's going to carry Israelis along with this. And I'll explain why I think that's important at some stage. But I would call it de-Zionization, because I think that what you pointed out, that is where we are. That there were other strands in Zionism which weren't nation-state centric, which weren't denial of Palestinian rights centric. There was a binational Zionism problem. That one didn't win. That version didn't win. Okay? So the version that won, and the version that's been in practice, in its mindset, if you like, has been antithetical to the prospect of, fill in whatever word you want, coexisting, peace, simply recognizing Palestinian rights, allowing for the existence of Palestinian rights and freedoms, etc. That's the version that won out. And that will have to be undone. But why I said in that sentence that at some stage one is going to have to offer a version of the future which looks radically different from the past, which can carry enough of a cohort of Israeli Jews along with it, is because I do not believe that this ends up as a zero sum on either side. In other words, with only one caveat, and the caveat isn't the victory of Palestinian nationalism or Zionist nationalism. The caveat is climate change, actually. As long as this area is inhabitable, I believe that however far one goes down the path of seeing this as a form of settler colonialism, and I think that works. I don't think it's the only framing, but it works as a framing. Whatever the truth of that is, in 2024, the Israeli Jewish population is not going back to wherever. This isn't Algeria.
Yeah.
So I think that if your starting point, and I say this today because the degree of extremism, eradicationism, dispossession and displacement and second Nakba thinking on the Israeli side brings the zero sum into sharp relief, and I'm sure fuels, including the actions being taken, fuels a sense on the other side that if it's zero sum, if it's us or them, then it's them. But I realistically would argue, and I think it's not just about realism. I think there is, if one values the dignity of all life, this is not going to end with the physical removal from the expanse of that territory of either Palestinians or Israeli Jews. I feel much more comfortable, by the way, talking about the attachment to the land based on religious ties, shorn of the nationalism and the exclusivity, which certainly contemporary Zionism thinks about those things in terms of. But if both are going to live on this land, then I would argue that from the perspective of today, the attempt at partition has encouraged Zionist maximalism, and we need to go through a process where the essence of Palestinian rights must come to the fore, and that isn't compatible with any strand of Zionism that is politically salient today. So that is going to have to be totally rethought through, and that may sound fantastical. It's not a project for a week from now or a month from now. It will take time, and I understand actually, and I've been challenged on this, that in fact, the events of the last months may strengthen those who say, listen, if both are going to stay on the land, then just separate them out. And we have to go back to that model. I think that encouraged the things that we see today, but I totally understand the argument.
I'd like to touch upon the United States. Am I too off mark or off mark at all if I was to say that quite a significant chunk of the problem with Israel lies in Washington and is within the American psyche? Would I be sort of peddling a myth or a legend or probably even a little bit of a trope if I was to say something like that? Because I personally sometimes, and do allow me, I mean, I'd hate to be mansplaining to a person like yourself, Daniel, but I mean, sometimes I feel...
I just discovered a term, Anas. It's goy-splaining.
There we go. We'll use that. So, I mean, I sometimes get the sense that America and American new cons and the likes of Lindsey Graham and the likes of, and Trump and Biden even, and they care more about the, the well-being, if you wish, of Israel than I find Netanyahu caring about Israel. I mean, from where I sit, and do absolutely correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I feel that Netanyahu is essentially trying to protect whatever political capital or capacity he still retains. But when I hear Blinken, for instance, When I hear American Republicans talk about Israel, I sense a deep sense of affection, of care, of of concern for Israel's standing, for Israel's future, for Israel's well-being. Am I off the mark here?
Well, first, let's acknowledge two things. Number one, we seem to have come to a similar place in terms of God-given rights only really matter that much when no one is saying, hold on, you can pray in whatever way you like, you can have whatever rituals, but when it comes to stuff that happens in the real world that requires guns and political cover and economic cover, there's a whole nother set of considerations which aren't just about what you claim are your God-given rights. And we, the international order, rule of law, the UN, the International Court of Justice or the Criminal Court, we all have something to say about that. And you can keep trying to pursue your God-given rights, but this may become increasingly uncomfortable for you, and you'll have to do it with someone else's weapons. In other words, we're coming back to the idea that Israelis or a cohort of Israelis or a cohort of Israeli leadership can think whatever they like about what they deserve. They only get it if the permissive environment exists in which they can get it. Otherwise, we can never have come to this. Number one. Number two, there's a Netanyahu factor here, which is, he is a leader who has been there longer than any other Israeli leader by quite a distance, which means he has a great deal of experience. He's bloody good at being a political animal who can maneuver out of situations. He is also a man in court facing numerous criminal charges who could end up in the nick, in jail. Yeah. And that is really important for him that he doesn't end up there. And so there's Netanyahu considerations, but I don't want to overindulge those because I think there are a set of considerations and a set of positions that exist broadly in the Israeli political ferment that go well beyond those personal political considerations. So setting that aside, how do we get to a position where many people, we may be amongst them, would look at this and say, I have my deep skepticism about the US and the role it plays, but even setting those aside, surely for the US itself, this doesn't look good. You spend 2 years preaching to the world about a certain set of rules and laws and values in one conflict situation in Russia, Ukraine, and then you literally drive a tank through all of those and you make yourself look ridiculous globally by then behaving and talking and doing the things that you've done through these months and, of course, long before when it comes to Israel, the Palestinians, Gaza, etc. So how do we explain that? And do they care more? Let's do the hard, but not all that, I would argue, controversial. Yes, people will get called out for mentioning it, but let's just do that piece. I don't know about you, but I, living here in the UK, quite often look at the US. I see the news of another mass shooting, and I am baffled that they don't have tighter gun control. Yeah. And you can only understand why they don't have tighter gun control if you understand the role of lobbies in US politics, and the role of money in US politics, and the role of the National Rifle Association. And that's true of Big Pharma, and that's true of other issues, and it's really true of Israel, okay? So we all know that, and there should be nothing particularly controversial in acknowledging a reality. And the role of financing in US politics has only gotten worse. We're talking on a day, and therefore by the time this is watched by people, there'll be a result in this congressional primary contest. Yeah. I think it's New York's 16th district, where Jamal Bowman is being challenged by a mass of pro-Israel money. There's no other way to describe it. And these are far-right MAGA people sometimes who are getting in a Democrat primary, spending a ton of money, the highest ever amount of money spent in a congressional primary, simply to unseat someone who has stood up and taken a position on Israel-Palestine, Jamal Bowman. So the role of money in American politics, we shouldn't make short shrift of. But the NRA, the gun issue, has a mythology that comes with it. It isn't just about dumping a load of money. And Israel and that issue has a mythology that comes with it. And part of that mythology is Judeo-Christian tradition. And a part of that mythology is things that are far more ugly, and Islamophobia in contemporary American society. So there is all of that. And then, of course, for a significant cohort, for the dispensationalist evangelical Christian community, this really isn't about what's good for Israel ultimately, or what's good for America. This is about bringing about the rapture and the second coming, and they have a whole theology around that. Yeah. So there are layers here. Yeah. There are levels of explanation which get us to the reality that we're in today, and to not be naive, one of them is also the role of the military-industrial complex, the role of the arms industry. And the Middle East is a very happy hunting ground for people who make a heck of a lot of money, also create a lot of jobs in manufacturing over arms sales, not just Israel, of course, but by keeping this level of conflict in the Middle East, you also have other countries that spend even more money on American weapons. And you've got the geopolitics, where if the US wants and is tacking to a focus on the contestation with China, then you want your allies to manage that region without too much American expenditure and military footprint if America wants to focus elsewhere. And they see Israel playing a role in that, but Israel's more useful here playing a role if it does so with other American allies in the region. So all of those things come together in a way which has a tremendously distorting effect, not only on American politics, because if you actually poll Americans, they are not with what their government is doing. Certainly Democrats. You have a significant majority that is not supportive of the position the Biden administration has taken, for instance. But here we are. It has a distorting effect in the US, and that distortion plays out massively. Israel, put most simply, Israel could not be 9 months into dropping the kind of ordinance, carrying out the kind of daily military assault on Gaza, which has led to urgent provisional measures being called for at the International Court of Justice, which has led to the request for arrest warrants at the International Criminal Court, which has led to so much death, destruction, starvation. This could not be happening were it not for the constant flow of American weapons. And if one consignment of US weapons was held up, that becomes the big fuss, not the hundreds of convoys that have flowed and have made this destruction possible. So it's very distorting.
Daniel, before I put you on the spot and ask you to solve the problem,
now I'm going to filibuster this next question.
I'd like to, a comment regarding the position of the UK. I mean, there was a time, and particularly after Oslo, when the UK and, let's say, generally speaking, Europe had an important role. Let's not exaggerate it or overblow it and call it pivotal, but it was fairly important, and particularly with the initiation of the quartet and the peace envoy and the such. But over the past few years, it seems that role has fizzled out for a number of reasons. It might be because of British internal politics. It might be because of Brexit. It might be because of, other factors. It might be because of, America taking charge of the whole thing and basically dismissing anyone else. I don't know. But where do you stand in regards with the UK government's position, influence, impact, and future role when it comes to Israel-Palestine?
Okay, I mean, you embedded correctly, especially in historical terms, if I may, the UK with Europe, which of course it was part of until some years ago. And I think there was this sense that that kind of America and Europe could play almost a balancing role. I don't think that was ever correct, there was some notion that in the peace process, the Europeans would help the Palestinian side, the Americans would be more with the Israeli side, and somehow there'd be a chemical reaction and an equation where we'd fix this. Europe was never really in a position to do that. What has happened? I think several things have happened, and that they are true mostly of the UK as well. In Europe, of course, you have internal fights. You need foreign policy by consensus, so that's not an issue once the UK is out of the European Union. But what you have had is, I think, a few things went on. One is this got increasingly wrapped up in a domestic politics, which has gone on a journey in the West. That journey is partly, I would argue, a result of the economic crisis and the fact that living standards actually go down all the time. You combine that with 9/11, in this country with 7/7, and with the kinds of tropes around the Muslim community and the kind of Islamophobia that took hold, pumping cultural wars and people feeling that they, or the ease with which a certain brand of politics could convince people that they're being left behind and their living standards crisis isn't because of the nature of late era capitalism or economic policies that were being pursued by their governments, but rather it's because of those people coming here. And so I think all of that has contributed to a shift in the politics around these issues. I would then throw into the mix that Israel made a decision at a certain point in time. I'm not saying there was one day people met and made a decision, but it went on this journey where understanding that there might be a problem here as the occupation becomes clearly permanent, as the structures post-Oslo to manage the occupation become transparently Bantustanist and therefore more easy to depict in those apartheid terms. As Israel goes on that journey, some people who claim not to like those kinds of things and people who mobilize to sanction and boycott and create a cost for doing those kinds of things in the South Africa apartheid reality might start to thinking of doing the same with Israel. And therefore, what's your best form of counter position? And the thing that emerged as the best effective way of dealing with this was, can we, anti-Semitism is something that rightly should be opposed and seen as a stain if anyone is accused of anti-Semitism in the West. And with the history of the Holocaust, which is, of course, a Western thing, the way to counter this is let's shift the terms of the debate, not to what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, but to what kind of anti-Jewish animus do you harbor to be making these arguments? And therefore, you have to go through this process of redefining anti-Semitism, of centering Israel in anti-Semitism, of making sure that Jewish communities and then other institutions and then mainstream public opinion, or at least elite opinion, will come along with you on this journey of intentionally conflating what anti-Semitism is. As someone who is proudly Jewish, who genuinely fears anti-Semitism and genuinely thinks that when we live in an intolerant time, this is something to be concerned about, and that in fact an anti-racism struggle has to include all forms of racism. And if you single out and exceptionalize and then make a mockery, basically, of what constitutes anti-Semitism, you're actually doing a great disservice to Jewish communal well-being. But that view is still in a minority. I think most of the mainstream Jewish communal institutions went along with something that Israel did, not out of concern for the well-being of Jewish communities. Israel did this as an act of statecraft in order to defend itself. So that was a long
Yeah.
detour.
Yeah.
But I think that is part of the explanation why the politics in the UK and elsewhere in Europe are where they are today. I would hope that we can get to a place where the UK and perhaps other parts of Europe are at least not an active enabler
Yeah.
of bad things over there in the region, and an active enabler of using this issue
Yeah.
to drive home division in our own country, to silence protests, to criminalize communities, whether those be Muslim communities, whether those be Arab and Palestinian communities in the UK, indeed, whether those be non-anti-Zionist or simply critical Jewish voices.
Yeah.
So I would hope we can at least neutralize that. If there is going to be a different push for different outcomes and different policies and different realities in the Middle East, I'd like to believe that the UK could be part of that. But I would come into this with as little naivety as possible as to the heft of that role. The UK still is a P5 member, of course, at the UN Security Council. But I would say that if we're serious about recalibrating the equation of policy on Israel-Palestine, we should be leaning a lot more into the already emerged, they're no longer emerging, they've already emerged powers in the global south, what they can do and how they can challenge the West on some of these issues, including the UK.
Okay, finally, as someone who heads the Middle East project, and let's assume that you have the ears and the attention of decision makers in Israel, in Washington, and in London. What would you be telling them? What would your advice be? How would you frame a way out? A way out not only of what's going on and has been going on now for 9 months, but generally speaking, how do we ensure that we arrive at a position where this does not, cannot even happen ever again? What would you be telling them?
So, were that it were so easy that people were simply bereft of good advice.
Yeah.
The willingness to take that advice looks very different whether you're sitting in London, Washington, or West Jerusalem. And therefore, I have now come to the position that it is not for the absence of good policy ideas or good advice. And the crucial one here is on the Israeli side. And I would love to wake up one morning, open my media and discover that there is an Israeli leader who is telling their people, we will never have security unless the Palestinians have security, unless the Palestinians have a horizon and a future. And by that, I do not mean we should be providing some more Humvees and neat uniforms for the Palestinian security forces, which work for Israeli security, not for Palestinian security. But by that, what I mean is we have to front and center that these people are humans also, and unless we see them as such, they won't see us as such. And therefore, not only do we have to dismantle the occupation, but we have to go back and look at what kind of a truth and reconciliation process we can go through to redress the wrongs of the past, including those committed to our own people. And you could find, not the narrative I just told you, but you could find a narrative that could conceivably resonate and offer Israelis a better future. I do not think I'm going to wake up to that morning unless at least two things happen first. Those two things are, first of all, that Israelis begrudgingly, reluctantly, but unavoidably experience a reality in which it is not normal for them to be continuing with these policies, in which Israel does not get to carry on with the normal life. And I condemn what happened on October 7th. I also condemn the policies that Israel pursued towards the Palestinians. for decades prior to October 7th, and of course what has been done ever since. So if Israelis think that they can live a normal reality while Palestinians who live among them and whose lives they control are kept in these conditions of separate and unequal, deep structural violence and discrimination, Israel will not know security. But Israelis aren't going to thank anyone for boycotting them, but they'll start to ask questions. So Israel has tried to kind of say, A, we don't need to see Palestinians, and B, there's no cost to that, which is the fastest path to dehumanization. In South Africa, the anti-apartheid campaign, for instance, meant that South African kids for whom rugby was a kind of rite of passage in life, for the core constituency of the National Party, of the Afrikaner apartheid structure, they suddenly saw that in the outside world, South Africa couldn't compete in international rugby anymore. Something they cared about, something they were good at. And the campaign was no normal sport in an abnormal society. Now, the equivalent for Israel may be competing in football competitions. It may be how its economy goes. It isn't, by the way, I believe, going to be going after a few settler extremists and taking measures against them. I also believe that the academic boycott, for instance, elements of it may be the easiest place to go, but it's not going to be that which impacts the core constituency of the Israeli voting public who supports these actions. So I don't think Israel will change, A, unless its incentive cost-benefit calculation structure changes, and B, which kind of goes back to something we said earlier, unless it sees that there is an alternative which is going to be really challenging, but it can offer them a way forward. In other words, and again, I don't want to overdo these South Africa analogies, but it's there and it can be useful, but we have to totally adapt. There's no two situations are the same. But the ANC Freedom Charter, which talked about a post-apartheid South Africa, in which white South Africans didn't have the privileges, didn't have the supremacy that the apartheid structure accorded on them, but they had a place, a legitimate place in that future, a place of equals, not of superiors, of equals. And here, that's where the Palestinian challenge to Israel really matters. Do you have a strategy, a struggle narrative? Do you have a platform of what the future will look like? Those things really matter. Then, when you come to London and Washington, D.C., I would try and explain those things to them, but I don't think there will be an attentive audience unless they feel political pressure from below to act differently, to start to hold Israel accountable, to remove the impunity, to demonstrate that there are costs to these things, and to get out of the business of trying to handpick Palestinian leaders who are convenient for Israel, who are convenient for some of the neighboring states in the region, who are convenient to them as the West, or who are sufficiently uncompelling, uncharismatic, ineffective that they don't really matter. Simply to get out of that, let Palestinians choose their inclusive, unified, or whatever they decide it will be, leadership.